Welcome to the deep dive. If you woke up this morning and looked at your phone, you already know that the geopolitical map of the Middle East was essentially rewritten overnight.
Yeah, it is a completely new reality today.
It really is. I mean, the unwritten rules of the shadow war, the delicate balancing acts, the red lines that everyone supposedly agreed on,
All of that is just gone.
gone. So today we are cutting through the overwhelming noise of these February 28th strikes.
Right, because the news cycle right now is just blinding.
Exactly. We are looking at a stack of raw data for you. Real-time dispatches from the Institute for the Study of War, the Middle East Institute Financial Market Telemetry, and declassified military updates.
We want to understand exactly how a cold standoff just erupted into a massive multi-nation hot war.
Because this is a profound paradigm shift. We are looking at an overt daylight conflict now between the United States, Israel, and Iran.
And to truly grasp the scale of what happened this morning, you have to look past the immediate explosions. You have to analyze the strategic calculations that made this escalation seem inevitable to the actors involved.
Right? Our mission today isn't just to read you the headlines. We are going to unpack the timeline. We'll look at the immediate causes, the failure of diplomacy, the devastating human toll on the ground, and the global economic shockwaves that are literally rippling through the markets as we speak.
But before we jump into that timeline, there is something very important we need to establish about the source materials we are analyzing today.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. We're going to be looking at direct statements, speeches, and stated objectives from U.S. President Donald Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Right, and the language in these sources is highly charged.
Extremely charged. So just a quick note for you listening, our goal today is not to take a side. We are not endorsing any political figure or validating any of this rhetoric.
We're just impartial observers here.
Exactly. We are looking at their exact, unfiltered words purely as objective guides. Because understanding their stated motives, what they are telling their citizens and the world, is the only way to comprehend the sheer scale of this escalation.
You really cannot analyze a war without analyzing the psychology and the publicly stated goals of the commanders directing it. You have to look at the text impartially to understand the strategy.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how we woke up to ballistic missiles flying across the Persian Gulf today, we actually have to dial the clock back just a little bit to late January and early February 2026.
Because this didn't just happen out of nowhere.
No, not at all. We have seen escalating tensions since October 2023. We saw those direct exchanges of fire in April and October of 2024, but reading through the geopolitical analyses, it seems the true catalyst, the immediate precursor to today's crisis, was actually what happened in June 2025.
Right, the June 2025 conflict.
Yeah.
That is often referred to in the sources as the 12-day war.
And that is absolute critical context here.
It is the foundation of everything happening today. In the military archives, those joint strikes in 2025 were designated Operation Midnight Hammer, conducted by the U.S., and Operation Rising Lion, conducted by Israel.
I remember the coverage of that. It was huge.
It was viewed as a massive, almost unprecedented kinetic event aimed directly at Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
So they hit major facilities back then, but if they already fought a high-intensity 12-day war over Iran's nuclear program less than a year ago, why did we just see an even larger strike package launched this morning? I mean, did the 2025 operations fail?
Well, fail is a really complex word in military strategy, but from the perspective of Washington and Jerusalem, it was ultimately a tactical delay rather than a strategic solution.
Okay, walk me through that. What did Midnight Hammer and Rising Lion actually achieve?
They caused significant physical damage. They managed to penetrate the underground enrichment facility of Fordo, which is built incredibly deep into a mountain. And they severely damaged the uranium conversion site at Isfahan using this massive barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles.
So they broke the hardware.
They broke a lot of hardware. But here is the crucial caveat that intelligence analysts highlight in our sources. You can bomb a centrifuge, but you cannot bomb a physicist's brain.
Wow, right? The knowledge is still there.
Exactly. The strikes did not eliminate Iran's institutional knowledge. The scientific expertise remained completely intact.
And what about the actual radioactive material?
That is the other problem for the U.S. and Israel. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, confirmed later in 2025 that Iran retained the industrial capacity to resume high-level enrichment work. They still had a significant stockpile of highly enriched uranium that survived those strikes.
Which means the threat of a nuclear weapon was essentially untouched? They just had to rebuild the physical infrastructure around it.
Precisely, and they clearly started doing that immediately. The core capability was preserved. So by the time we roll into early 2026, the intelligence assessments in Washington and Tel Aviv are flashing red again.
Which leads directly to the massive military buildup we saw in January and February.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that buildup was not standard.
Now, looking at the naval dispatches from late January, the sheer tonnage of military hardware moving into the region is staggering. The U.S. didn't just send a few ships to patrol. They moved the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group straight into the Arabian Sea. They deployed squadrons of F-22 Raptors to forward bases. In fact, they eventually surged a second carrier strike group to the Middle East. One of the defense reports explicitly noted that logistics officers were preparing for potentially weeks-long operations.
And the logistical footprint is always the tell.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Isn't surging carrier groups just standard operating procedure for the U.S. when they want to establish deterrence? Classic gunboat diplomacy. How do we know this January buildup wasn't just Washington trying to bluff Iran into backing down at the negotiating table?
It's a fair question, but the specific composition of this deployment is what tipped off military analysts that this was absolutely not a bluff.
How so?
Well, deterrence is about holding a line right, making an adversary think twice about attacking you. But when you look at the forward deployment of F-22 Raptors, which are highly specialized first-strike stealth air superiority fighters.
They are essentially door kickers.
Exactly. And when you look at the staging of bunker buster munitions, you're looking at an offensive strike package. The messaging coming out of the Pentagon, signaling preparation for major combat operations, indicated a shift from a reactive posture to proactive preparation.
So they were actively positioning assets to initiate a preemptive kinetic war if diplomacy failed.
Yes. And speaking of diplomacy failing, the political theater happening in the background of this massive naval buildup is honestly giving me whiplash.
It is wild. We are tracking two completely different diplomatic channels in February 2026, and they seem to exist in parallel universes. Let's look at the Oman track first.
Right. The Muscat negotiations.
On February 6th, there are indirect talks happening in Muscat, mediated by the Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi. And reading the dispatches from Muscat, you would genuinely think world peace was about to be signed. Just yesterday, on February 27th, al-Busaidi was on record saying a breakthrough was within reach.
Yes, the Omani mediation track is fascinating because it represents the technical approach to arms control.
What were they actually proposing?
According to the diplomatic readouts, the Omanis were brokering a highly specific technical off-ramp. Iran had reportedly agreed to allow full, unhindered IAEA verification of their facilities.
Okay, that is a big concession.
It is. And crucially, they were also offering to irreversibly downgrade their existing stockpiles of enriched uranium to the lowest possible level.
So they would cap the physical material so it couldn't be used for a weapon, but they keep the actual centrifuges spinning.
Exactly. It is a containment strategy. Iran gets to keep its domestic nuclear program for civilian use, which saves face domestically, while the international community gets guarantees the weaponization is physically capped. It is a highly nuanced technical compromise.
But then we look at the other track, the demands coming out of Geneva from the U.S. administration under President Trump, and there is absolutely zero nuance there. It is a brick wall.
Starkly different. The U.S. negotiating stance in Geneva bypassed all those technical compromises Oman was working on. The central demand from Washington was absolute zero enrichment, period.
Meaning no centrifuges, spinning no civilian program, nothing. Complete dismantling of the nuclear architecture.
Complete dismantling. Furthermore, the Geneva demands expanded the scope significantly. The U.S. wasn't just focused on the nuclear issue anymore. They demanded that Iran also address its ballistic missile program.
And this is where the collision becomes inevitable, right?
It is the breaking point.
Why are the missiles such a sticking point, though? I mean, if Iran is willing to downgrade the uranium, why let the whole deal collapse over conventional missiles?
Because for Iran, the ballistic missile program is not an offensive luxury. It is their primary and arguably only conventional deterrent.
Because of their air force.
Right. If you look at the balance of power in the region, Iran's air force is largely composed of aging legacy aircraft. They cannot compete in the sky with the F-35s and F-22s fielded by the U.S. and Israel.
They just don't have the tech.
They don't. Therefore, their entire strategic defense doctrine relies on their ability to launch massive swarms of ballistic missiles to overwhelm adversary defenses. Asking them to dismantle their missile program is, from Tehran's perspective, asking them to unilaterally disarm in a hostile neighborhood.
So you have the Omani foreign minister trying to thread the needle on uranium percentages, while the U.S. in Geneva is essentially demanding total capitulation on both the nuclear and the missile fronts. And this is all backed by two carrier strike groups sitting in the Arabian Sea.
And that fundamental dissonance is what closed the final diplomatic off-ramp. The objectives were completely irreconcilable. The U.S. required the total verifiable dismantling of Iran's threat architecture. Iran required sanctions relief while maintaining what it views as its sovereign right to self-defense.
So when diplomacy hits a dead end under the shadow of a massive military buildup, the kinetic option ceases to be a contingency and becomes an inevitability.
Which brings us to the morning of February 28, 2026.
Today,
Today, the shadow war is over, diplomacy is dead, and the sky literally opens up.
the Department of Defense officially announces the commencement of Operation Epic Fury. And simultaneously, the Israeli Defense Forces launch Operation Roaring Lion, which we are also seeing referred to in some Israeli domestic dispatches as Shield of Judah.
The scale of these joint operations is staggering. It is important to emphasize for you listening that this was not a series of isolated drone strikes or covert sabotage missions, which has characterized so much of the shadow war over the past decade.
Right, this wasn't a cyber attack.
No, this was a synchronized, massive aerial bombardment targeting sovereign Iranian territory.
I am looking at the strike maps from the Middle East Institute right now, and the geography of the attack is incredibly broad. We are talking about massive explosions rocking the capital, Tehran. But they also hit Isfahan, Qom-Kharaj, and Kermanshah. Can you walk us through what is actually at these locations? Why this specific target list?
It is a comprehensive decapitation strike against their military-industrial complex. Isfahan, as we mentioned earlier, houses the uranium conversion facility. That is the heart of the nuclear supply chain.
Okay, what about Kharaj?
Kharaj is known for housing critical centrifuge manufacturing sites. If you want to stop them from rebuilding their nuclear program, you have to destroy the factories making the parts.
Makes sense. And Kermanshah?
Kermanshah is heavily associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps,
Oh,
the IRGC, specifically their ballistic missile storage and launch silos hidden in the mountainous terrain there. And then Qom houses the Fordo enrichment plant. They were systematically dismantling the IRGC's ability to wage war and project power.
but there is a detail in these strike reports that represents a massive, unprecedented escalation. It wasn't just military bases and missile silos. The joint strikes specifically targeted the residential compounds of Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian right in downtown Tehran.
Yes, and the implications of that cannot be overstated. We are seeing early satellite telemetry confirming extensive damage to Khamenei's highly secure compound. Now, Iranian state television was very quick to broadcast that both the supreme leader and the president have been moved to secure underground locations well before the strikes and were unharmed.
But the fact that they dropped munitions on the direct residences of the head of state and the head of government, that fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict, doesn't it?
It changes everything. It confirms a definitive shift in strategic objectives. Operations Midnight Hammer and Rising Line in 2025 were about degrading military assets and delaying a program. Hitting the Supreme Leader's compound in 2026 is an overt, undeniable attempt at regime decapitation.
And if we look at the rhetoric accompanying these strikes, the leaders are not hiding this objective at all.
Not even a little bit.
Let's look exactly at what was said this morning. We have the text of the video statement released by U.S. President Donald Trump just hours after Operation Epic Fury began. He announced the commencement of major combat operations to eliminate imminent threats. But then he directed his message straight past the Iranian government and spoke directly to the Iranian populace.
Which is highly unusual in a military address.
Exactly. Reading his exact words, he declared that the hour of your freedom is at hand, and he explicitly urged the Iranian people to, quote, take over your government. He also vowed to completely raze the Iranian missile industry to the ground and annihilate their navy.
When a sitting U.S. president pairs a devastating bombing campaign with a direct public call for the citizens of the target nation to overthrow their government, the strategic ambiguity is gone. The objective is regime change.
And this objective was mirrored almost perfectly by the messaging coming out of Jerusalem.
Right. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a recorded address regarding Operation Roaring Lion. He stated the strikes were necessary to remove an existential threat to Israel.
He echoed the U.S. sentiment, too, stating that the joint action would create the conditions for the Iranian people to, quote, take their destiny into their own hands and throw off the yoke of tyranny.
But Netanyahu went a step further by anchoring this modern military campaign in deep historical and religious context.
Yes, the Purim analogy. This really stood out to me in the transcripts. Netanyahu noted that these strikes were occurring just before the Jewish holiday of Purim. He drew a direct, explicit parallel between the strikes today and the ancient Persian story of Queen Esther and Mordecai defeating the wicked royal vizier Haman, who had plotted to annihilate the Jewish people in the Persian Empire some 2,500 years ago.
His exact quote was, "The lot was cast, and the end of the evil regime will also come."
We really have to consider the weight of that historical framing.
Absolutely. He is contextualizing a 21st century conflict involving stealth fighters, bunker busters, and cyber warfare within an ancient existential narrative of divine deliverance and the absolute eradication of an enemy.
By invoking Purim and Haman, Netanyahu is signaling to his domestic base and to Iran that this is not a limited tactical engagement over centrifuge counts.
It is viewed as a definitive epochal battle for survival. When both the U.S. and Israeli leadership publicly framed the war as an absolute necessity for the collapse of the government in Tehran, it traps all parties. There is no longer a middle ground to negotiate.
And if there's no middle ground, the only response is maximum retaliation. Which brings us to True Promise 4.
Iran did not pause.
They didn't assess the damage and go to the UN to complain. Almost instantaneously, as the U.S. and Israeli bombs were falling on Tehran, Iran launched its own massive counterstrike.
The speed of True Promise 4 is highly revealing. It tells military analysts that Iran had fully anticipated the collapse of the Geneva talks and had their retaliatory architecture primed, fueled, and ready to launch at a moment's notice.
This was a pre-planned, massive ballistic missile campaign. The initial wave of missiles targeted Israel, specifically aiming at major population and command centers like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The reports describe sirens blaring continuously, the home front command apps flashing red across the entire country, and the complete shutdown of Israeli airspace.
But looking at the broader map of True Promise 4, Iran didn't just strike Israel. They opened fire on the entire region.
This is where the conflict instantly metastasized from a trilateral war into a full-scale regional conflagration. Iran directed a significant, perhaps even the majority of its ballistic missile arsenal at United States military assets hosted across sovereign Arab Gulf states.
I want to list these out for you listening because the geography is staggering and it really paints a picture of a region on fire.
Go ahead.
The military updates confirm that Iranian ballistic missiles targeted the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, which is located in the Jufair area of Bahrain. They targeted the massive Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which is essentially the central nervous system for U.S. Central Command.
They struck the Al Dhafar Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, too.
Yes. They hit the Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait. And they even targeted the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, which is notable because the U.S. had just surged dozens of fighter jets there in the weeks prior.
You are describing a sweeping arc of fire that crosses the entire Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. And the critical question here is the strategic logic. Why is Iran launching highly valuable ballistic missiles at sovereign Arab nations like Qatar and the UAE, who are technically non-belligerents in the U.S.-Israeli preemptive strike?
That's exactly the right question to ask. Doesn't it just turn the whole neighborhood against them?
You would think so.
It is a calculated risk based on a doctrine of asymmetric deterrence. Iran is sending an unequivocal, violent message to its neighbors. Any nation that hosts U.S. military assets, any nation whose airspace radars or runways facilitate an attack on Iranian soil is considered an active participant in the war and a legitimate military target.
There is a very specific tactical claim from the IRGC that highlights this. Amidst the barrage on Qatar, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard claimed to have completely destroyed the U.S. FP-132 radar installation located there. What is the FP-132 and why is that such a big deal?
This is a vital piece of the puzzle. The FP-132 is a massive, highly advanced early warning phased array radar system. It is basically the U.S. military's primary set of eyes for the entire Persian Gulf.
What does it do exactly?
It's designed to detect ballistic missile launches from hundreds of miles away and feed that telemetry instantly to Patriot and THAAD missile defense batteries across the region.
So it's the tripwire.
Exactly. By blinding the FP-132 in Qatar, Iran degrades the United States' ability to track and intercept subsequent waves of missiles.
That makes tactical sense.
But strategically destroying an asset like that on Qatari soil forces a crisis for the host nation. Qatar now has to weigh the immense danger of hosting American forces against the wrath of their massive neighbor, Iran.
Iran is attempting to exact such a high price from these host nations that they are pressured into expelling American forces or at least denying them operational use of the
Right,
bases.
it forces the entire Middle East into the crossfire.
It's easy for us to sit here and talk about early warning radars and geopolitical chess moves, but we cannot ignore what this actually looks like on the ground. We have to look at the human cost of this escalation. Because behind the rhetoric of regime change and the maps of air bases, there are millions of civilians caught in the middle of a nightmare.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about what happens to a society when a war like this kicks off. First, the lights, or rather the data goes out.
The digital blackout.
Yeah.
It is a hallmark of modern, high-intensity conflict.
I'm looking at the internet watchdog group NetBlocks. They published a report showing a near-total internet blackout in Iran almost immediately as Operation Epic Fury began. We are talking about connectivity plummeting to just 4% of ordinary levels nationwide.
And we should clarify for you, this isn't because the U.S. bombed the server farms.
No, the NetBlocks telemetry strongly indicates this was a state-enforced measure. It perfectly mirrors the internal network shutdowns the Iranian government utilized during the June 2025 conflict and during massive domestic protests before that. Why would a government shut off the internet for its own people while they are being bombed?
It is a ruthless but highly effective tactic for state survival. By enforcing a digital blackout at the onset of a foreign invasion or massive bombing campaign, the state achieves several critical objectives. First, it severely limits the flow of information out of the country.
Right, keeping everyone in the dark.
The international community and the attacking forces are blinded to the immediate on-the-ground damage assessments and any localized military movements. Second, and perhaps more importantly for Tehran, it allows the state to maintain absolute monopolistic control over the domestic narrative.
With the internet gone, the only source of information is state-run television and radio, which remain operational.
But the human toll of that is horrifying. Imagine you are sitting in your apartment in Tehran. The air raid sirens are screaming. You feel the shockwaves of bunker busters hitting the IRGC bases on the edge of the city. You grab your phone to check on your parents to see where the strikes are hitting to look for emergency alerts, and you have zero signal. You are completely isolated in the dark.
It magnifies the terror exponentially. When civilians cannot communicate, when they cannot coordinate with family members or access independent safety information, panic sets in. It severely complicates civilian safety protocols.
And tragically, that danger resulted in devastating loss of life today.
Yes, we have to relay these facts from the reports with the somber empathy they require. In the chaos of this massive exchange of fire, a joint U.S.-Israeli strike hit an elementary girls' school in the Minab area of Hormozgan province in southern Iran.
It is a devastating reality of aerial bombardment. Even with the most advanced precision-guided munitions in the world, the fog of war, intelligence failures, or the proximity of military assets to civilian infrastructure inevitably leads to tragedy.
The casualty reports are heartbreaking. Initial sources state over 50 students were killed in the strike in Manab. Some international monitors are pushing that death toll as high as 85 young girls.
It is just awful.
And the civilian casualties are not contained to Iranian borders either. The reports note civilian deaths in Syria after an Iranian retaliatory missile went off course and struck a residential building. We also have reports of at least one civilian killed by falling shrapnel from an intercepted missile in the United Arab Emirates. The violence respects no borders.
It is a sobering reminder that while leaders speak of precision strikes and surgical operations, the reality on the ground is always messy, unpredictable, and paid for with civilian lives.
Let's look deeper at the view from the streets of Tehran because the domestic reaction we are seeing in the sources is incredibly complex. The initial picture is what you would expect, absolute chaos.
The reports describe mass panic.
Heavy, gridlocked traffic jams are paralyzing the highways as thousands of people try to desperately flee the capital. There are endless chaotic lines at gas stations as people try to hoard fuel.
The physical reaction to an unprecedented bombardment. But what is truly fascinating to analysts and deeply revealing about the internal state of Iran right now is the fractured ideological reaction among the populace.
This is one of the most stunning details in the reports. You have this profound duality. On one hand, Iranian state media is broadcasting images of people mourning the dead, fiercely during the time of war.
But the independent reports and diaspora networks document a completely different parallel reality happening at the exact same time.
There are multiple verified reports of factions both inside Iran and in the global diaspora actively celebrating the airstrikes.
We see reports of university students and citizens openly chanting slogans against the supreme leader in the streets, even as the bombs are falling on their cities.
And in the diaspora in European cities like The Hague, Berlin, and Hamburg, massive crowds gathered outside Iranian embassies to dance, cheer, and celebrate the attacks on the regime's military infrastructure.
What does that tell us? When a sovereign country is being actively bombed by foreign powers, and a highly visible portion of its own population is cheering for the bombers, what does that reveal about the internal stability of the Iranian state?
It reveals a profound, potentially terminal fracture in the social contract.
For decades, the Islamic Republic has relied heavily on the threat of external enemies, the great Satan of the U.S. and the Zionist entity of Israel, to unify the country through nationalism and to justify its strict authoritarian control.
But you have to remember the intense domestic unrest that has plagued Iran, particularly the massive protests that swept the country in late 2025 following economic collapse and social crackdowns. The sources note those crackdowns resulted in thousands of civilian deaths at the hands of the state's security apparatus.
Though the resentment is boiling over.
Exactly. The regime has alienated vast swaths of its own population. When citizens begin to view their own government as a more immediate, dangerous threat to their lives and freedom than a foreign military dropping bombs on their capital, the internal stability of that regime is historically precarious.
This is precisely the vulnerability that the U.S. and Israel are banking on, with their explicit calls for regime change. They aren't just trying to destroy missile silos. They're attempting to throw a match into a powder keg of domestic fury, hoping the Iranian people will finish the job the bombers started.
And while Iran burns internally, the shockwaves of this conflict are literally stopping the rest of the world in its tracks. We need to look at the global fallout, the economic and logistical earthquake that hit on February 28th. First, let's talk about the logistics. The skies just emptied out.
It was an unprecedented, instantaneous regional paralysis of commercial aviation.
I was looking at the flight tracking maps from this morning, and there is just a massive gaping hole over the Middle East. Massive airspace closures were enacted almost simultaneously across Iran, Israel, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Qatar, and the UAE.
We are talking about the busiest, most critical transit corridors connecting Europe to Asia.
Global airlines like Air India, British Airways, Air France, Emirates, they were frantically diverting planes mid-air. Hundreds of flights were canceled outright. The logistics of global travel were severed in an afternoon.
And this brings us to the immediate tangible impact on the global economy. This raises an important question. How does this affect you, the listener? This is where a conflict thousands of miles away instantly affects your wallet. The financial dispatches are entirely focused on one geographical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz.
We always hear about the Strait of Hormuz whenever tensions rise in the Middle East, but what are the actual mechanics of it? Why does it cause such immediate panic in the markets?
The Strait of Hormuz is the single most critical choke point in the global energy supply chain. It is a very narrow waterway between Iran and Oman connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
Just how much oil goes through there?
Approximately 20% of the world's total global oil supply passes through that strait every single day.
Yeah.
Furthermore, a massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, primarily exported from Qatar, also transits through there.
And according to the military updates, Iran immediately warned that no ships would be allowed to pass through the strait. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard essentially threatened to close the valve on a fifth of the world's energy. How do they actually do that? Do they just line up ships and block it?
They don't need a massive naval blockade. Iran practices asymmetric naval warfare. They utilize fast attack craft swarms, anti-ship cruise missiles mounted on the coastline, and most effectively naval mines. Just the threat of laying mines in the strait is enough to send insurance premiums for oil tankers skyrocketing to the point where commercial shipping halts entirely.
And the financial reaction was instantaneous. The commodities reports note that Brent crude oil surged to near $73 a barrel, almost immediately on the news of the strikes.
Commodity markets abhor uncertainty above all else. A hot war involving the world's primary energy producers with missiles flying over the very air bases that protect those oil fields is the ultimate uncertainty.
If the Strait of Hormuz is actually mined, or if oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia or the UAE is severely damaged by Iranian retaliation, we aren't just looking at a surge in gas prices. It could trigger massive, sustained global inflation and plunge the world economy into a severe recession.
And the panic wasn't just in traditional commodities. One of the more fascinating details in the financial dispatches was the reaction of the cryptocurrency markets.
Oh, right. We saw reports of major crypto assets, specifically XRP, plunging significantly amidst the turmoil. Why would a physical war in the Middle East cause institutional money to flee a digital currency?
It highlights the maturation of the crypto market. In previous years, some argued crypto might act as a decentralized safe haven during geopolitical crises, but today it trades heavily as a risk-on asset for institutional investors.
So when things get scary, they drop it.
Exactly. When bombs start falling and a global energy crisis looms, institutions panic. They liquidate their riskier, highly volatile assets, like XRP and other cryptocurrencies, and flee to traditional tangible safe havens, like gold, or to the stability of the US dollar. It was a universal flight to safety across all asset classes.
Which naturally leads to an absolute scramble in the diplomatic world. The international community woke up to find the Middle East on the brink of total war, and the diplomatic reaction highlighted the deep, dangerous fractures in global consensus.
The UN Security Council had to call an emergency meeting immediately, but there was absolutely no unified voice to be found.
Russia's response was particularly aggressive. They came out and laid the full blame for the entire escalation squarely on the United States and Israel. The Russian delegation accused Washington of using the Geneva nuclear negotiations as a cover operation, a deliberate distraction to stall for time while they positioned their carrier groups for a planned preemptive attack.
Russia is seizing the opportunity to frame the U.S. as the aggressor, solidifying their own alignment with Tehran. Meanwhile, regional mediators were left entirely sidelined.
Like Oman.
Yes, Oman, who had literally just been hosting promising peace talks in Muscat hours prior, expressed deep dismay. Their statements essentially told the U.S. this is not your war, to start reflecting the immense frustration of Gulf nations who now find themselves in the crosshairs of Iranian missiles.
But I want to look closely at the traditional Western alliance because the stance of the European allies was highly nuanced and honestly very telling.
What do they say?
Nations like the UK, France, and Germany issued strong, immediate condemnations of Iran's retaliatory missile strikes against Israel and the Gulf states. The UK even confirmed that British fighter jets from their bases in Cyprus were in the sky actively intercepting Iranian missiles to defend their interests and allies.
That is the crucial bout. They defended against the retaliation.
Right.
But as the diplomatic sources clearly note, London, Paris, and Berlin notably stopped short of offering any blanket support or endorsement for the initial U.S.-Israeli preemptive strikes on Tehran.
It is a profound tightrope walk. The European capitals are obligated to defend against ballistic missile attacks on Allied territory. But their refusal to endorse Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion exposes a deep fundamental unease with the Trump and Netanyahu strategy.
So they are not fully on board with regime change.
The Europeans were willing to engage in diplomacy, even tough diplomacy, but they are clearly balking at a strategy of massive preemptive escalation aimed explicitly at regime change. It shows that Washington and Jerusalem are pursuing this maximalist objective largely isolated from their traditional European coalition. Okay, let's take a breath and recap the staggering sequence of events we've unpacked today. We started by looking at how the unfinished business of the 2025 12-day war and a massive U.S. naval buildup set the stage. We saw how a cold standoff culminated in a complete diplomatic collapse, with technical compromises in Oman failing against the absolute demands for zero enrichment in Geneva.
And the failure of that diplomacy triggered massive preemptive kinetic strikes by the U.S. and Israel operations, Epic Fury and Roaring Lion.
And we noted the terrifying shift in strategy. They weren't just targeting military bases, they hit the residential compounds of the Iranian leadership with the explicitly stated goal of inciting regime change.
Which immediately shattered the boundaries of the conflict.
Exactly. It led directly to True Promise 4, a widespread, pre-planned regional retaliation by Iran that struck U.S. bases across multiple sovereign Arab nations, deliberately widening the war. We examined the tragic human cost on the ground, a nationwide digital blackout plunging millions into terror, the devastating deaths of dozens of schoolgirls in Manab, and a deeply fractured Iranian populace where some mourn the fallen while others cheer for the destruction of their own government.
And finally, we saw the immediate global shockwaves. Empty skies, surging oil prices, threatening a global recession, institutional flight from risk assets like crypto, and a fractured international community scrambling to respond.
It is a sobering reminder of how incredibly fast a simmering shadow war can explode into a hot, multi-nation conflict that impacts the entire globe.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a lingering critical question to mull over. We have just witnessed the definitive sunset of the Middle East shadow war. The gray zone is gone. The unwritten rules of deniability, proxy skirmishes, and proportional response have been burned to the ground.
So what comes next?
If the explicit goal of a military superpower, Shifts from merely containing a rival's nuclear ambition to overtly demanding the physical overthrow of its government. Is there any off-ramp left for diplomacy? When an adversary believes with absolute certainty that their very survival is on the line, what are the limits of escalation?
That is the terrifying question that will define the coming weeks, months, and perhaps years. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense journey through the sources today. It is heavy, complex material, but understanding the why behind these massive shifts is incredibly important. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the headlines, and most importantly, stay curious. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.